welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, we're going to talk about something that doesn't get brought up nearly enough, especially from the top side of the slash. And this is going to be a show that I resonate a little bit more because it's part of the world that I inhabit in the lifestyle. But before we get into all of that, I want to thank all of you, whether you've been listening since the beginning or you're tuning in for the first time, for sending me your questions, talking to me on AMA, your emails, your engagement. If it really does make a difference, and it's why I keep showing up here every week, it's for all of you, just to give you a little bit more insight and help along the way. So if you're enjoying what I do here, do me a favor. Make sure you like, subscribe, follow it wherever you listen. If you're on Spotify, a rating, if you can rate the show 5 stars, it helps other people find the show. Maybe even share an episode that they might need to listen to. And if you want to support the work that I'm doing here, there's a donation link in the show's description. Every little bit helps keep these, big conversations going forward. And if you're somebody or maybe even a company and you're interested in sponsoring my show, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me through the email provided in every show's description. I'm starting to open that door now because I'm looking for partners who align with the values behind this work. All right. So on today's show, we're going to really talk about what lives beneath a lot of the scenes, but really doesn't get said out loud a lot. So this particular show is for the sadists who absolutely started out with intention, right? Present in your dominance, attuned to your partner, clear about your role. And now maybe you're starting to wonder if this is still a choice you're making, or it's become the only way you feel connected or stable or even seen. This isn't about shaming dominance. It's not about pathologizing sadists. It's about reflection. And we're looking at how sadism, for some, slowly shifts from being a chosen erotic expression into an emotional structure. How control that once grounded you can begin replacing vulnerability, our clarity, and sometimes even our intimacy. And we are going to look at what that shift sounds like, how to spot it in yourself, and what the psychological research says about it and why it happens. Because power should be chosen, not clung to. So let's first talk about presence and disappearance. You didn't start out lost in it. Most sadists I've worked with, or in a lot that I've known, didn't come into dominance looking for control because they were falling apart. They came into it with clarity, intention, and understanding. They knew what that presence gave them. It gave them purpose and direction and intention, a way to actually show up in the moment with somebody else, not as a way to hide, but to actually connect to someone. And in the beginning, that control meant something. It was intentional and erotic and directed. You weren't playing to prove anything. You were playing because something in you felt more real when you were leading. And that wasn't a problem for you. It was a gift. The structure, the choreography, the power, all of it had weight for us. And it brought out something in you that didn't always have room to breathe in your day-to-day life. But over time, something can start to shift slowly and quietly and even subtly. And maybe you notice that outside of these things, you start to feel a little bit more detached, less anchored, less responsive. Maybe emotional conversations actually feel harder to engage with. Or you find yourself thinking about the play, not just because you want it, but because without it, something feels off, maybe agitated or dull or incomplete. And here's the part that most people don't say out loud. Sometimes dominance stops being something you choose and starts something, being the only way you feel like yourself, especially more so when you are in the sadistic realm. And that's the moment where this role starts to blur with identity, where sadism isn't just about who you are in your erotic map anymore. It becomes your emotional structure, your way to regulate, your way to feel effective, your way to feel connected. And that shift doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It definitely doesn't mean you're dangerous or you're broken, but it does mean it's time to step back and ask, is this still what I want? Or is this about what I need in order to function? And there is a difference between engaging in sadism because it brings you something real and relying on it to stay intact. Dominance can be powerful, it can be connective, and it can be deeply intimate. But when it becomes the only place you feel seen, or the only time you feel capable, or the only part of you that gets to come forward, you've got to take a breath and look at that. Because if you stop choosing it, and it starts choosing you, then something shifted beneath the surface. And that's where we're going to go next. And I really want to talk about what that shift looks like and why it happens. So let's get into when sadism becomes regulation and how control starts grounded but becomes an emotional infrastructure here. Sadism at its best is intentional. It's not about destruction, it's about direction. You shape something, you build tension, you create an experience inside of the scene. And for a lot of sadists, that control is erotic, but it's also emotional. It brings us focus, it makes you feel present, and that's not dysfunction, that's clarity. And at first, that clarity feels very clean. You're in the role by choice. You decide when you're going to step into it and when you step back. You're attuned to your partner. You're grounded in your own desire, and you're not just in control, you're connected. But over time, for some sadists, that dynamic starts to shift. And that shift doesn't usually start with a scene, it starts outside of one. You notice you're not as steady when you're not topping. That irritation shows up on your days off. Maybe the sense of being unanchored or passive in your daily life. A drop here in the emotional response. You don't feel as alive unless you're holding the power. Now, you might tell yourself you're stressed or you're restless, but you know there's actually something different. Sadism in those moments stops being just an erotic outlet. It becomes a tool for our emotional regulation. I talked about this person the other day when I wrote about masochists and their identity. And this person wrote all the way back in 1997, Baumeister, and he describes sadistic behavior not only as a form of arousal, but as a way for people to affirm their sense of self when they're otherwise disoriented or disconnected or even feeling ineffective. So in other words, for some sadists, control becomes the way they recognize their internal world when nothing else is working. And there were some other researchers that actually looked into this further. Now, all of this references I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to put them they're going to be in the description of this episode, right? But these two, Morkos and Osterheider, they pointed out that sadism isn't always about cruelty, and it actually can be structured. It's a responsive behavior that helps stabilize emotion. Now, for many people, especially those who don't have other tools for emotional clarity, for example, dominance becomes that structure. And when your identity feels blurry, sadism can bring that sharpness. And it's not just psychological. There is neurological research that backs this up. In 2015, there was a neuroimaging study done that showed individuals with sadistic interests had increased activity in the regions of the brain linked towards reward, self-reference, and even empathy when witnessing another person's pain. Now, that actually surprises quite a few people, but it shouldn't. Sadism isn't about lacking empathy. We don't lack empathy when we are delivering pain, right? We find joy in it, right? Because our partner, typically a masochist, is also thriving on the delivery of the pain. So in many cases, it's the opposite. You're deeply attuned to how somebody reacts, what they need, and more so, what they can take. But when the process becomes the only way you feel engaged with yourself or others, it can stop being about the partner and start becoming about the regulation, about maintaining a sense of coherence through the control. And in another study in 2012, it found that for some men, the brain responds to sexual stimuli, including sadistic stimuli, by activating the same areas that handle identity and self-awareness. That means these experiences don't just feel good, they feel real. They reinforce the self. That's why for some sadists, dominance becomes more than a scene. It becomes how they feel like themselves. But here's the risk. When you need sadism to feel regulated, you're no longer choosing it, you're actually relying on it. And you might start needing scenes to feel emotionally present. Without them, you feel off-balanced or distracted. Maybe intimacy doesn't involve power, and then you see that as starting to feel flat. And you might find yourself disconnecting from vulnerability and tenderness unless it's wrapped in some sort of structure for you. That's not sadism as choice, that's sadism as compensation. And that's where a lot of people get stuck, because from the outside, you still look composed. You're still negotiating your scenes, you're still playing safely, You still deliver with intensity, but internally that control isn't optional anymore. It's actually how you're staying afloat. So the question here becomes, are you topping because you want to, or because without it, you don't even know who you are? Now, that's not an accusation. It's actually an invitation to start thinking about this, because dominance should expand you. Sadism should be something that's an extension of you, but it shouldn't be something that confines you. It should connect you, but not numb you. And if it's become the only way you can feel stable, then it might be time to ask what's driving your dominance and sadistic pleasures and tendencies now, and whether you still feel free inside for the role that you've built for yourself. Now, let's look at dominance as an identity when that role replaces the self. Now, for a lot of sadists, there is a moment when the scene ends, but the role doesn't. You're not in the dungeon lighting anymore. There's no impact toy in your hand. There's no collar on the table, and yet you still feel like you're performing. The shift isn't always dramatic. It doesn't come with flashing lights or a warning label here, but slowly, and what started as something you chose to step into slowly becomes something you don't even know how to take off. At first, sadism was the language. It helped you express yourself. It brought that connection, your attention, the intensity, the power. It gave shape to how you love, how you lead, how you respond. But at some point, it stopped being a choice and it started becoming your default identity, not something you use, but something you are. And that shift changes how you relate, especially to others and yourself. Michael Foucault, in The History of Sexuality, talked about how power doesn't just control behavior, it shapes our identity. It creates roles that begin to live inside, often without realizing it. So, if you show up again and again in the same posture with the same expectations, the same types of scenes, the role starts to actually define you. It becomes how people see you, and it really does actually become an extension of how you see yourself. Now, William Reich went even deeper here. He argued that some people take on the rigid character roles when the emotional expression for them is blocked. In his book called Character Analysis, he described how people unconsciously armor themselves with behaviors that keep them feeling safe, but also cut them off from being vulnerable. Sadism can become that armor here. It starts as a structure for us, but when it becomes your only point of access to connection, it stops being a tool and it starts becoming a shell. Erich Fromm, in The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, described a sadistic character not as someone who seeks cruelty for its own sake, but as someone who needs control to compensate for a deep fear of helplessness. The dominance isn't just about the erotic power, it's about avoiding the internal experience of being unsure and unseen or even unsteady. And that's what makes the shift so hard to recognize. From the outside, you still look like you're in control, you're still composed, but setting the scene, commanding that attention, giving that structure, all of these things are starting to flow, but internally there's a lot of hollowness. You might notice that emotional intimacy outside of kink starts to fade. Conversations with your partner feel less engaging unless you're guiding. And quiet moments of softness feel out of reach or even out of touch. Your partner might start to feel more like a role player in your performance than a person in your life. Now, you might not realize how far it's gone until someone asks, can you feel close to someone without guiding them in a dynamic or being in a sadistic scene with them? Or maybe if the scene stopped, would you even feel wanted? And these are really hard questions, but they actually matter, because when dominance and sadism becomes the only version of yourself that feels worthy of attention or affection or even connection, you're no longer doing this just for the sake of enjoying that erotic space. You're surviving. And you're holding on to a role because it gives you something your unmasked self doesn't know how to access. Now, none of this means sadism is the problem. What it means is that any role, when fused too tightly with your identity, can start to take over. And when that happens, you lose the ability to choose. You start reacting instead of responding. you start performing closeness instead of experiencing it. Now, the danger isn't the sadism. The danger is forgetting there's a whole self underneath it. And if you can strip away the protocol, the pacing, and the presence, what's left? Can you be seen without the control, without the dominance, without the sadism? Can you receive without directing? And if not, what's in charge? Because sadism should add to your identity, not replace it. If it's taken over the space where your vulnerability used to live, then it might be time to actually reclaim that space. Not to lose the sadist, but to reconnect with the person inside of that world. Now, reclaiming choice and returning sadism to agency and not survival is what I actually want to dive into next here. Now, you don't need to stop playing. That's not what this is about, and that's not what I'm saying. This isn't a call to abandon your dominance or sadistic pleasures, or to even turn your back on the power exchange, or to even pretend that sadism can't still bring you something real. It absolutely can. And for many people it does. This is about ownership, about knowing where your choices come from and whether they're still choices even at all. Because there's a difference between playing to feel more alive and playing because you don't know how to feel alive without it. And there's definitely a difference between control that brings you deeper into a connection and control that keeps you from having to feel too much. So this is the point where I'm going to say, ask yourself, is this feeding me or is it just holding me together? Am I performing safely or actually experiencing it? Now, these questions aren't meant to tear you down. They're meant to bring you back to yourself, because the role doesn't have to mean rigidity. Dominance doesn't have to have a box you live inside of. You're absolutely allowed to stretch. You're allowed to shift and move around. You're allowed to reflect on who you are right now, not just who you were when you first built your life. But you can't let it evolve if it won't let it be questioned. And there's no shame in realizing that you've outgrown the version of sadism that you've been practicing, right? There's no failure in stepping back and to look at how your dominance might have changed. Maybe it's gotten sharper or more efficient or more technically skilled. But has it gotten more human or more honest or even more flexible? A lot of sadists learn early on how to read a room, definitely anticipate a response, or definitely dial up that intensity. But what a lot don't learn is how to pause, how to say, I'm not sure if this is where this is coming from today, or that I may need a moment before I engage. Maybe even say, right now this doesn't feel like a choice. And that pause absolutely matters, because it's in that space where agency lives, not in the performance, not in the posture, not in the scene, but in the stillness before, right? And in the willingness to ask yourself, what's motivating the dominance today? Is it my desire? Is it pressure? What about disconnection or fear or loneliness? Agency is knowing you can still step into your sadism, but that you don't have to. And when you get that back, the dominance starts to feel different, not because it's lost power, but because it's regained intention. You're allowed to rebuild that intention to decide what kind of sadist you want to be, right? Especially now, to lead from a place that's less about holding yourself together and more about showing up in the present and whole. Dominance is never just about control. It's about clarity. It's about direction, presence. So if it's to become something that disconnects you, confuses you, or even consumes you, right? That invitation to come back is something you need to consider, not to walk away from it, but to come back in your own terms. Because the version of you that started on this path still matters. But so does the version of you who you are now. And asking harder questions, sometimes the ones that are going to be uncomfortable to think about or discuss. And that version deserves a sadism that reflects where you are, not just where you started. Now, sadism is powerful when it's grounded in choice, when it reflects who you are, not what you're trying to hold together, when it opens doors and connection instead of closing yourself off from everything. But when sadism is the only way you feel seen, or when it's the only version of you that gets to come forward, that's not power. That's captivity. And it doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Every sadist I've ever respected has had to revisit their dominance at some point. not to question if it's real, but to ask if it's actually still theirs, which is why support groups or mentors are so valuable, especially in a lifestyle. So if this conversation is starting to stir something inside of you, even if part of you thought maybe, hey, I'm a little closer to the edge of that shift than I realized, then you're already doing something about it. You're having a conversation with yourself and about what your sadism means to you. Because the moment you start asking whether this still fits, you've started returning to a choice. So I'm going to leave you with a question today. What kind of sadism would you practice if no one was watching? Right? Because that's where your agency starts again. So I want to hear your thoughts. I know this is a little bit bigger of an episode. This one is, a kind of a companion to what I did for masochists, right? But there's a lot more to this. I didn't want to bog this show down and make it feel like I'm beating on sadists. I'm not. I am trying to help the sadists I know. And as a matter of fact, a lot of them know and practice what I'm talking about, right? Because a lot of times I'll discuss capacity. And they will ask themselves, do I have the capacity to play this week? Do I have the capacity to step into this scene and do what I need to do? And that's such a wonderful distinction. But it's taken them years to get to that point, to realize their own agency and why they do it. When they talk about sadism, it's like honey dripping from their lips. And that's kind of a point for sadists or dominants, really why we're in this position, because we enjoy that control and authority. But remember, with sadists, it takes it a step further. So let me know what you think about this today, especially if you're a sadist. If you maybe want to come talk to me about this, I'm open to having a conversation with somebody. I'm absolutely contemplating right now a group panel show. I'd love to hear your thoughts from everybody on that. Maybe a panel discussion on something where we are all kind of debating a few different topics, not talking over each other, but just debating some stuff, right? Yes, I'm still working on a new worksheet for the community. I'm a little behind right now because I'm just really busy. Red Leather and Hi There Catsuit are going to be slated in. My apologies still go out to them. I'm reaching out this week to start solidifying some dates so I can bring that to you all. I'm really keen on sitting down with her. Just her passion for the community is so wonderful. If you've never seen anything she writes, check her out on FetLife. Wonderful, wonderful, insightful writings. I do have a book, Tangled Desires, the intersection between psychology and BDSM. Not even a top 1,000 on the New York Times bestseller list, maybe on the, hey, if you are bored and got nothing else to read, that's where you're going to find my book. I mean, look, I say this in part jest, but it's true. My book was a little repetitive. First thing I ever wrote. There is a lot of good stuff in there. It's just, hey, I put in a little bit extra that I didn't need, but you know what? It's how we learn, right? We make mistakes, but we don't live with regret. So I did my book. Whether I do another one, I don't know. A couple other things. So last week was about reclaiming my voice, and I've done so, but I am initiating some new policies as far as things. If you start pushing me for personal information, I am no longer not going to respond. I'm going to block you. I have a right to privacy. Everybody has a right to privacy, and they have a right to just feel comfortable in their life. People aren't owed things. So these are just going to be more so my responses now as I move forward. Other things that are coming up, some people have been asking me about deeper rooted questions. To be very clear, I don't work with neurodivergency. That's a different aspect completely of psychology. It's not a field that I'm versed in. So as much as I want to answer those questions, I'm going to be giving you a more generalized, less specific answer than you might be looking for. It's not because I don't want to. It's just not my specialty. So I wanted to let everybody know about that. But yes, bring me some more questions, some more thoughts, something you might like to hear on the show. Happy to look into it for you, right? And then let me know what you think about the show today in the comments section below. And again, please rate me 5 stars on Spotify. I really want to keep boosting the show. I want to get it out there. right? And again, if you are interested, you want to work with me, you'd like to sponsor my show, send me an email. My ears are open. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.